money environment. Before money was developed, there was barter. And that is, there's no medium of exchange there, it's just direct exchange. Somebody has one thing, another person has another, and they swap the two, and there's no medium. If I have, today barter is pretty common. If I have a Model T, restored Model T car, and I'm tired of it, I'm tired of fixing it, and somebody else has a Steinway grand piano, and I thought, that's something I would like to have. I can swap my Model T Ford for their grand piano, and again, that's barter, everybody understands that, but there's no medium of exchange there. So now when we come to this word medium, we've got money. And as I said a moment ago, there are 4 different kinds of mediums of exchange. The first kind, and the most fundamental kind that developed in history, is called commodity money. And that is, as the word suggests, it's a commodity which has intrinsic value of its own. It's something that people value and can use even if it were not used as money. And the earliest examples of that would be food. In Egypt, of course, we have all these records. I remember when they discovered all of these clay tablets in the Middle East here about 80, 85 years ago, 90 years ago. There were thousands of these clay tablets, and some of them contained some very valuable historical information. We won't go into that, but the anticipation of the geologists who were uncovering this was that, oh my gosh, here is ancient history. This is history that we lost when they burned the library at Alexandria. You know, they were going back to the origins of civilization. And they were so excited, but then when they found that some people could actually read this stuff, these ancient script, they found out that most of it was records of wheat, wheat exchanges. So many jars of wheat from this person to that person. It was an accounting record. There were historical records there, but most of it was just accounting, and it was all about wheat and cattle. And those are the origins of money, the medium of exchange. We were talking, I believe it was last night, there was a young lady at the table, and there was kind of a trivia question that came up, said, what's the oldest form of currency or money? And let's see, I was going to vote for wheat. And she said that she had read in authoritative reference that it was salt. And I guess that's probably true. Even though that's not food, it's very closely associated with food. And it's something that was universally desired, had value. And so the point of all of this is that people would acquire excess quantities of something that they could not use themselves directly. But they were willing to stockpile it because they knew it was universally in demand and that they could use it as a medium of exchange. And so food is the most common historical example of that. Cattle were very valuable all throughout Europe. As a matter of fact, the word that we still have in our vocabulary today, pecunia, pecuniary exchange, pecuniary transaction, comes from the Latin word pecunia, which means cow. So there we have in our own modern language a remnant of the connection between commodities and a medium of exchange. Well, that worked fine. There were certain things that were more desirable than others in the field of commodities. Eventually, the one commodity that evolved that became the most sought after was metal. Now, in the beginning, they didn't have the ability to refine metal. But in the period where they began to learn the science of metallurgy and began to make iron and steel weapons in particular, because weapons, as you can imagine in a primitive society, are perhaps the most valuable thing of all, to protect yourself, to protect whatever you've acquired, or if you were an aggressive person, as to attack and to steal, to take. There's a lot of that going on, and still going on in the world today. So weapons are always sought after. And so in the very beginning, the people who were able to refine a little bit of iron and mix it with some nickel and discovered that they could make steel out of it, and steel was useful for swords and for shields and things like that. in a period like that, naturally you would expect metal, iron and steel, to become a medium of exchange. And indeed it was. And anybody with a block of metal, refined metal, was in pretty good shape. Even if he had no use for it himself, he knew that sooner or later there'd be some warlord or some ruler or some empire would come along and purchase that in terms of food or other things, or entitlements or something like that. And so metal became a very popular medium of exchange, and that evolved into, as we all know, the precious metals. It eventually became the most desirable type of metal to hold was something that was difficult to acquire and short in supply, but still also had value to most people. And so that evolved into silver, and gold became the most desirable type of metal. And in the beginning, these metal ingots had no particular shape, but they were valued because of their weight, and because even in those days there were primitive means of determining their purity. They could weigh them and they could sample them, and by this time they'd already learned about the displacement of water and the mass relationship of mass to weight, and they could come pretty close to an accurate analysis of the purity of the gold or the silver in the little ingots. And so the first coins in the world really were ingots. They were just little chunks of metal that were exchanged, medium of exchange. And then finally, this evolved over a couple of hundred years to the point where the rulers of the empire began to take over the ingot issuing business, and they began to stamp their faces on these little ingots, and they made them round instead of rectangular. And lo and behold, the ingots became what we now call coins. But they're really, all they were just little ingots of precious metal, and they were used as a medium of exchange. It's as simple as that. And so that was the beginning of money, and receipt money is a very good form of money. I mean, excuse me, I'm ahead of myself. Commodity money is a very good form of money. But now we come to the next important evolution, which is receipt money. And this too, we'll find, is a good form of money, even though it's based on paper. It may surprise you to hear me say that, but it's perfectly good money. With the development of paper and paper-like substances, they sometimes use the bark of certain trees, had an inner lining beneath the bark, which was usually white, although sometimes darker than that. And with the development of that, it became possible to have receipt money. And the way that evolved is very simple. The people who were holding these gold and silver ingots as a storehouse of wealth naturally had to worry about protecting them. Security becomes a very important issue when you have wealth in this form. And they had to have guards. They wouldn't want to leave their domain, that wherever they had this stuff buried or hidden, they had to worry about someone discovering it. And so that was a big concern. Within each of those communities, there was a goldsmith, a person or a group of people who specialized in the fabricating of jewelry, gold and silver jewelry, a very much in demand commodity at that time. And these people obviously had quantities of gold and silver on hand, and so they were targets. You can well imagine. Anybody, a thief or a group of thieves, that we know where the money is. It's like the old joke, they asked the bank robber, why do you rob banks? He said, that's because that's where the money is. And so people knew that the goldsmiths had the money. They had the gold and the silver. So the goldsmiths had to have vaults and 24/7 guards, and they did a pretty good job of that. Otherwise, they would have lost everything. So other people in the community began to sense that that was a pretty good place to put their gold and silver. So I don't know who the first chap was, but somebody walked up to a goldsmith someday and said, you know what? Well, I've been thinking about this. I've got some gold over here, and you've got a vault. I don't have the vault. Could I pay you to guard my gold for me, please, along with yours? I'll be willing to pay a reasonable fee for that. And the goldsmith said, well, sure, that's a reasonable deal. It won't cost me anything because I'm already guarding my supply. So they struck a deal, and the first instance of banking happened without anybody realizing it. Someone put on deposit